listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. With the unofficial election campaign in full swing, we're not going to stop hearing about the several crises plaguing our country, two of which are gaining a huge amount of attention right now: housing and immigration.
Immigration is fine, good for a country, nothing wrong with immigration at all. It boosts demand, increases GDP, makes the economy look great. The trouble is, you've got to build more houses for the people and you've got to build more roads and bridges and infrastructure. That wasn't done.
So what role is immigration playing in Australia's housing market crisis? That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spyrou, and for something different, we welcome our new team member Tara Cassidy to the headlines as well. It is Thursday, the 20th of March.
Good morning, guys. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. Now, this first story I am a big fan of already. Anthony Albanese has announced a new election promise, vowing to cut the cost of 4 out of 5 medicines listed on the PBS. Currently capped at $31.60, a re-elected Labor government would lower the cost to a maximum of $25 a script, with the change to come into effect next January. It'd save Aussies an estimated $200 million a year at a cost to the budget of $690 million over the next 4 years. The coalition's been forced into supporting another Labor policy on the back of the big Medicare funding boost last month and have agreed to match his announcement too.
It comes as American medical giants target the PBS, saying Australia's medicine pricing system is discriminatory and that Donald Trump should put tariffs on our pharmaceuticals in retaliation. To quickly explain, the pharmaceutical benefit scheme subsidises the cost of medicines for us here in Australia, so we don't have to pay too much. The government directly negotiates with suppliers in the US to make them cheaper, but will often opt for generic brands over the more expensive originals. It's long been a point of contention for American pharmaceutical industry, but now with Trump in the White House, it'll be looking to capitalise on a president that is more than willing to ruffle the feathers of allies.
Now, what they'll be hoping for is that our government runs scared of tariffs on our own pharmaceutical exports to the US, and that in response, Australia will make changes to the PBS. But in good news, the Albanese government has already ruled that out. Now, Australian pharmaceutical exports were worth about $1.89 billion in 2023, so it's not an insignificant amount that could be affected. And we are waiting for this fresh round of tariff announcements from Donald Trump, which is due to happen on April 2 US time, so it'll be more like April 3 for us. Australia's pharmaceutical and beef exports are apparently among those that are in the firing line. Now, the coalition is urging Albo to fly to the US to have urgent meetings with the president to try to avoid this. I don't think that would work. I think we've already seen that this new administration is not interested in playing ball at all.
And I mean, in this post-COVID Zoom era, why does Albo have to hop on a plane to go have those negotiations?
I mean, it makes a bigger impact, right?
Allegedly.
Who are you listening to over a computer screen? That fella down under,
okay.
Remember that?
Fair.
Remember? I want to make the point as well that the US cattle industry has been urging the Trump administration's trade review to target Aussie beef exports. So we've got the US pharmaceutical industry and the US beef industry coming together. Well, they're not coming together, but separately making representations to the White House saying you need to punish Australia because for our beef exports, we have a free trade deal, so a lot of our beef is getting into the States. They don't want that to happen anymore. So April 3, mark it in your diaries, because I think that's when things could get potentially a lot worse for Australia.
Vladimir Putin's been accused of breaking Russia's ceasefire promise to not strike Ukrainian energy targets just hours after his phone call with Donald Trump. President Volodymyr Zelensky is saying his Russian counterpart is not serious about peace.
Even after Putin's conversation with the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, there were 150 drone attacks overnight, including on energy facilities. There were also strikes on transport. Unfortunately, 2 hospitals were hit, and there were strikes on ordinary urban infrastructure.
That translation thanks to the BBC. Now, many of those attacks have been confirmed by local reports and verified footage, and it's understood there have been no casualties. Meantime, Russia has also accused Ukraine of retaliation, saying it flew several drones into its territory, targeting oil and gas facilities.
As to the prisoners swap agreed to yesterday, those have since been carried out, with 175 soldiers from each side returning home, as well as a further 22 severely injured to Ukraine. Now, taking to Truth Social early this morning, Donald Trump says peace talks are very much on track after confirming he had an hour-long phone call with Zelensky overnight our time. And he said the conversation has aligned both Russia and Ukraine in terms of their requests and needs. Chris, I don't really understand how that plays, given that there is still violence happening.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing this morning. Everyone's kind of scratching their heads going, how are things on track when the violence is continuing on land? I mean, Trump went into that conversation with Putin yesterday looking for a 30-day ceasefire, land, air, water. That didn't happen. All that we got was this very niche area of we won't strike Ukrainian energy. And I guess the question yesterday was, why are stopping energy strikes important? It is important to know that Zelensky claims about 80% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been destroyed by Russian attacks since the beginning of the war. So a country now that's coming out of winter, not having energy is very problematic. But a key point that a lot of people are making is that winter's ended there now. We're heading into spring. So Putin putting this on the table, it's kind of like the softest, almost like the bottom of the barrel when it comes to requests and things that are needed. I do want to turn to how Trump has spoken about his talks with Putin. He did appear on Fox yesterday saying they had made good progress, that Russia was committed to peace, but there was a very, very strong focus on what the pair discussed in building their bilateral relations.
They have some very valuable things for us, including very big forms of rare earth. They have a lot of earth. You know, they have a big chunk of real estate, the biggest in the world for a country by far. And on that, they have things that we could use, frankly, and that other people could use.
Yeah, spoken exactly how we'd expect him to. And look, the fear that's continuing this morning, like I touched on yesterday, is that Putin effectively dangled some pretty strong carrots in Trump's face, and Trump's going, oh, hello, Russia, we can make an ally out of you. And the fear this morning is that Trump is going to park Ukrainian needs in favor of what he wants and what, he will say is putting America first. As to those Russian demands, which was they want no more military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, we've heard already from Germany and France. They said that's absolutely not going to happen. And Macron overnight has reiterated calls for Ukraine to be at the table when it comes to any peace talks.
A new search for the wreckage of Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 has been given the green light more than 10 years after it went missing. The Malaysian government's agreed for exploration firm Ocean Infinity to search a section of the southern Indian Ocean, which is about 15,000 square kilometres in size, on a no-win, no-fee basis. So essentially, this company is going to do it for free, but if they do find the wreckage, they'll get about $115 million Australian.
Ooh.
Yeah. Flight MH370 and 239 passengers who were on board at the time, including 6 Aussies, vanished while flying from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing in 2014. And despite extensive efforts since, this is by no means the first search, one of many, many that we've seen over the last decade, the flight has never been found, and there's only been pieces of the plane that have washed up on surrounding shores.
Which is just devastating for all the families of the people that were on board, that in all that time it's still not been found. And we still don't know what happened. There's no closure for them. So I'm certainly hopeful that they're able to find it, because until we do, it's unlikely that they'll ever learn the truth about what actually caused the crash either. And while it's agreed on that the plane actually crashed into that specific search area of the ocean, we still don't know why. Although, as you can imagine, many people have speculated. There's been endless theories, conspiracy theories around what took place. Some have pointed the finger at the pilot, various governments, but we really don't know. It remains one of the biggest aviation mysteries in the world. There's still a lot of interest in the case. News outlets talk about it frequently across the globe. There's a Netflix doco, but hopefully soon there's something positive to report on it, because Ocean Infinity finds the wreckage.
Solid gold toilet bowls in my house. I want that good life.
And 2 men who stole a multi-million-dollar solid gold toilet from an English palace have been found guilty of the theft by a jury in England. The toilet was taken from Blenheim Palace, a country mansion where Winston Churchill was born in Oxfordshire back in 2019, and it's worth almost 10 million Australian dollars.
Now, the ringleader James Sheen apparently spotted the lush latrine before coming back with 2 accomplices to use sledgehammers and crowbars to steal it. They chucked it on the back of a stolen car and sped off. The whole heist was over in under 5 minutes.
Impressive.
Yeah, and the toilet's never been recovered. Authorities reckon it might have been cut up and sold in chunks almost straight after it was nicked. Now, they might have done that in record time, but they weren't so swift in other parts of the heist. They apparently left a trail of clues behind, including CCTV footage that spotted them and their own phone data, catching them out.
Gosh.
But 5 minutes, I mean, that's pretty quick considering the thing weighs nearly 100 kilos. Like, I would not stand a chance in that heist. I can't squat my own body weight. So
Maybe 2 people would have gotten it through. The thing I love about this golden toilet, and it's actually really sad that it's lost, it was a satirical artwork. It was called America by an Italian conceptual artist, and he was poking fun at excessive wealth. Now, Donald Trump, this toilet was previously at the Guggenheim Museum, which is in New York, and Donald Trump asked the Guggenheim in his previous administration, in his previous term, can you lend me a Van Gogh painting? And apparently the museum turned around to him and said, no, we can't do that, but we'll offer you this golden toilet if you like. Apparently the White House was not amused and did not respond to that offer.
Look, I don't know about you, but I would definitely take up a golden toilet offer, although I do have qualms when it comes to oddly coloured toilets. Now, stick with me here. When I travelled Europe 2 years ago, I stayed in a bunch of hotels and whatever, and one of the hotels I stayed in had a black coloured toilet.
Oh.
And can I just say that is the most uncomfortable thing, not in terms of comfort, I'm talking uncomfortable because you can't see what's going on, and I'm just not on board with non-white toilets is the point I'm trying to make.
No, I hear you. I feel like grandparents often have weird coloured toilets. I swear.
Or shell
toilet
toilets. Yes.
seats.
Where have they gone?
I think, bring them back.
No, do not bring them back.
I swear my grandma had a blue toilet. It's just like, why?
Fluffy toilet scrubbers. You know,
Oh,
those little,
yeah. Or the
like,
fluffy toilet
yeah,
seats,
yeah,
which
yeah.
is so unsanitary.
Not as cool as solid gold, sorry.
Yeah, no, nothing wins. Okay, guys, thanks on that note. Welcome, Tara, again to the headlines. We're so excited
Thank
to have
you.
you. You'll be taking over the reins from next week when I go on maternity leave. But for now, we are getting into Chris's deep dive, looking into what role immigration is playing in our housing crisis.
If you tune into a regular sitting day in Parliament, you would know that Australia is a country suffering through not one, but multiple crises. We've got a health and aged care crisis, a youth crime crisis, a climate crisis, and in case you haven't heard it enough already, an immigration and housing crisis. And more, the last two, immigration and housing, have become intertwined, with all the usual suspects getting right behind the narrative.
These people are your children, your brothers and sisters, your colleagues, people you went to school with, and they're out on the street because we've got this massive immigration, but more than our infrastructure can handle, and we've got interest rates that are so high that banks have repossessed houses and sold them to incoming people, and these people have nowhere to live.
We need to address the problems that we have in a country. High immigration, cut back on foreign ownership of our housing.
I want to restore the dream of home ownership, and that's why fixing the housing crisis and rebalancing our migration program are priorities for our government.
That was Clive Palmer, Pauline Hanson, and the man vying to become our next Prime Minister, Peter Dutton. The coalition maintains it isn't anti-migrant or racist, and that fixing the housing crisis requires a raft of things, including incentives to increase construction, cutting red tape to fast-track approvals, and allowing Australians to access their super for a deposit. But reducing immigration is always wedged in there as a solution, and like you heard, it's their top priority. And that's something that more and more ordinary Aussies are completely latching onto.
What little is available, there's dozens of people lined up. Lots of them are immigrants and they have plenty more money than I can possibly get. I want to know, is the government going to cut immigration to match housing availability, or are we just going to keep going until every regular working Australian is homeless?
But what role does immigration actually play in all of it? And do the coalition and other Conservative parties have a leg to stand on when it comes to this? Joining me now is the ABC's veteran finance journo, Alan Kohler. Alan, welcome to the briefing. Has immigration put too much pressure on Australia's housing market?
Oh, yeah, I think that's obviously the case. Immigration has increased quite a lot over the last couple of decades and has continued to increase. We've had a big surge in immigration in the last couple of years, in fact.
Is it at a rate that's causing as much alarm as the coalition and some right-winged parties would have us believe?
Look, immigration is a difficult and fraught area of policy because some people on the right want to turn it into a sort of a scary thing, want to use it as a sort of a racist dog whistle to kind of talk about immigration in terms of races of people to keep Australia white or something. I mean, I think there's a bit of an undercurrent of that. You know, there's a bit of an attempt, I think, in some parts to kind of emulate what Donald Trump is doing. I mean, he's kind of partly got elected on the basis of immigration and fear of immigration. But a lot of that is illegal immigration, right? So what we're talking about in Australia is not illegal immigration. We're talking about just, normal legal immigration. And from my point of view, what I'm talking about is numbers, not about who's coming and where they're coming from. It's all just about numbers and whether Australia is ready for the sort of numbers that we're getting. And the thing is that from the mid-2000s, if you look at the numbers, what happened was that from around about 2005, Australia's immigration increased from 100,000 a year to 200,000 a year and then 300,000 a year. Or if you look at it in terms of percentage of population, you can see that in the chart it went from 0.5% per annum of increase to 1% per annum and then 1.5%. And the problem is that was an increase in immigration driven by the federal government policies, but really there was no accompanying change to the way infrastructure and housing policy was done. I mean, there was no kind of attempt to deal with that extra number of people by building more houses and by increasing the amount of infrastructure, number of roads and so on. So look, we've now got a housing affordability crisis and it's getting really difficult to get around. I mean, and there's a huge amount of spending going on at the state level on roads just to try to catch up. But it's still very difficult to get around. Now, I'm not saying that the housing crisis is entirely caused by immigration. It's not. That's not what it's all about, but that's certainly a part of it.
What slice of the pie, Alan, before we get into the historical reasons why we increased our migrant intake, what slice of the pie and what percentage do you think immigration accounts for when it comes to Australia's housing crisis?
It's kind of difficult to figure it out, but between 2005 and 2015, there was a shortage of housing, or there was a demand for housing exceeded supply, and that was the same period when there was a big increase in immigration. It's kind of difficult to exactly match numbers to numbers of houses. I've tried a few times to do it. Part of the problem is that natural increase is about 100,000, 120,000 a year as well. But the trouble is that in a particular year, obviously, the natural increase of 100,000 or whatever they are is babies, right? So they don't need a house. Babies don't need a house. So then you've got to go back to, 25 years ago to see what the natural increase then was, because that's when roughly, to say, 25-year-olds are now looking for a house, and they're the ones joining the hunt for a house. It's also the case that a lot of the immigration is students, foreign students, and they tend to rent. They're renting student accommodation. They tend to be looking in the cities, the CBDs, or around universities. It's only when they later become permanent residents that they start to look for a house and join that. So look, it's difficult to get those numbers exactly right, but I think it's fair to say that for 10 years between 2005 and 15, there was a shortage. Demand exceeded supply. Then there was a small oversupply for a while. Obviously, there was a big oversupply in the pandemic. Although not many houses were built, there were no immigrants for a couple of years. And since then, there's been a huge spike in immigration of between 400,000 and 500,000 per year coming in, on top of the natural increase 25 years ago of 100,000 or 120,000. So you then find you've got 500,000 to 600,000 people looking for a house, and then you've got to divide that by the number of people per house, right, which is on average 2.4. then you find you've got a demand for housing of around about 18 to 19,000 places per month. And for the last couple of years, housing approvals have been running at about 15 to 16, and now they've fallen this year to 13. I think it's fair to say we've got a shortage roughly of 4,000 to 5,000 dwellings per month, which kind of builds up,
I do want to bring it to present day, but before we do, very briefly, that period of 2005 and that decade onwards that you're talking about, what was the government's thinking with increasing the rates of migration into the country?
Yeah, so there were two things. One was that on July the 1st, 2001, the government of the time, which is the Howard government, decided to change the way international students were dealt with. Up until that point, the way it worked was there were gazetted countries and non-gazetted countries. If you came from a gazetted country, you got into an Australian university really easily. But if you came from a non-gazetted country, it was really hard, if not impossible, virtually impossible. And the thing is that the gazetted countries were the ones you'd expect, UK, America, New Zealand, Canada, and most European countries. The non-gazetted countries were China and India and a few others, Philippines and so on. So, look, it was basically a hangover from the White Australia policy, which hadn't really been changed. And it had to go, obviously. That distinction between foreign students from China and India in particular and from, white countries had to change. That had to go, and it did go. And at the same time, the government made it easier for foreign students to become permanent residents and made the process of moving from an international student with a student visa to permanent residence much more transparent as well as easier. And so what you saw over the following sort of 3 or 4 years was a huge surge in students from China and India, which came to Australia. And that was also driven by the fact that the Howard government cut funding for universities and told them they had to make their own money and fund their own research and their own staff and so on. And so they needed to have foreign students in order to pay for themselves. And so what happened in those years was a massive surge in international students from China and India. And that was really behind the increase in immigration from 2005. But it was also driven by demand from the business community for more staff and for trying to achieve an oversupply of labour to drive wages down. And don't forget, this was a time when Howard was working on work choices, and he was trying to undercut the unions through work choices. And so the idea of having an oversupply of labour really kind of fitted in with John Howard's idea of trying to destroy the unions. And the problem was, of course, that immigration is fine, good for a country, nothing wrong with immigration at all. It boosts demand, increases GDP, makes the economy look great. The trouble is, you've got to build more houses for the people and you've got to build more roads and bridges and infrastructure. And that wasn't done.
As you're across and every single one of our listeners is across, it is an election year. In 2 months' time, we're going to be heading to the polls. When it comes to the issue of immigration, it's being framed as a crisis, which Labor says they inherited, while the Libs say Labor opened the floodgates. Who do we believe here?
The Liberal Party opened the floodgates back in 2001 and during the 2000s. So the problem is that the government, whoever's in charge, the government doesn't control immigration, really. I mean, there's no target. All you get about sort of numbers of immigration, of intention about the number of immigrants into Australia is a forecast from Treasury as part of the budget. There's no attempt to say by either party when they're in government, the number of people we're going to have coming into Australia is X, whatever that might be. They don't actually have a target at all. And part of the reason for that is they can't actually control it. It's almost impossible to control. I mean, I know it sounds probably hard to believe, but it is true that, the government really is not in control of it. It's driven mainly by universities. About 40 to 45% of Australia's immigrants come via student visas. That is driven by about 2 or 3 dozen tertiary institutes, mainly the top 8 universities, but also lots of colleges. They kind of recruit students. They have agents, paid commission in other countries, recruiting students to get them here. So that's the largest component of Australia's immigration, and it's got nothing to do with the government almost. I mean, they issue the visas, but basically as long as somebody qualifies, they get a visa.
But doesn't the government have powers when it comes to issuing caps on international students arriving into the country?
No. The government tried to introduce a cap of foreign students last year of 270,000, but that was knocked back by the Coalition and the Greens in the Senate, and it didn't get through. And so as things stand, there is no cap. And so they're still trying to think about what are we going to do here. And the Coalition is talking about a drastic reduction in immigration, but there's no sign, no hint of how they're actually going to do it. They're talking about putting a cap on universities that's a percentage of their intake. They're saying that maybe we'll say that only 30 to 35% of student intakes each year can come from overseas, but they haven't worked that out yet, whether they can do it. So that's still a fair way off. The second biggest component of immigration is working holidays. But, the trouble with that is that the farmers really need working holiday makers, backpackers, to pick their fruit and veggies. And the hospitality sector really needs backpackers for staffing the cafes. And so they'd be stuffed if there was a cutback in working holiday makers.
Yeah, well, as you've touched on in this chat, there's a broad range of levers that the government can pull to somewhat curb or better manage this housing crisis. Some of the things you mentioned there was making approvals much more easier, getting construction booming again. Do you think curbing migration should be a top priority of the government when it comes to solving the housing crisis, or is it just one thing in a mix of things that they should be doing?
Well, I think the amount of immigration should be in some way connected to the amount of houses that can be built. I mean, there is not an infinite number of houses that the construction industry can actually build each year. I mean, there's a limited supply of labour, limited supply of materials. It's not rocket science to figure out how many. I mean, as I said, the housing approvals numbers is down to about 13,000 a month. Once an approval has come through, that means that the house is probably going to get built in the next 12 months. So you know how many houses are going to be built. So surely it's possible to, in some way, connect the number of people coming into Australia with the number of houses that can be actually built for them. But apparently that's too hard.
And look, before we let you go, we'll end on somewhat of a philosophical question. History's taught us in times of economic downturn, more and more people turn their attention and somewhat hatred towards migrants. It's a position that helped Trump and a number of right-winged European leaders win their elections last year and this year. Why do you think that is?
Xenophobia beats in the heart of many people. I do think that the question of immigration gets mixed up with illegal immigration. Obviously, there was a lot of problems in Australia with boats arriving here, and that became a very hot topic, and people didn't like the fact that people were just landing their boats here, and that was solved by a bipartisan policy of offshore processing, so that anyone who landed here got shipped off to Nauru, where they could be determined that they had whether they were a refugee or not. So we kind of solved that problem, but they certainly haven't solved it in Europe and the US. And people's refugee claims need to be dealt with properly. I mean, if somebody shows up and says, I'm a refugee, well, you have to take that seriously. So I understand that. I think that we do have a responsibility as a country to assist refugees, people who have problems in their own country and need to get away. We've got to help them. And we also need immigrants in Australia to replace the ageing of the population. I mean, the working age population is declining, so there's no doubt we need to have migration. The only question is how much of it, and how do we deal with refugees?
Alan Kohler, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
No worries.
That was finance journo Alan Kohler speaking with me there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That is it for now. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it. It's a really, really easy way you can support us and all that we do here at The Briefing. And hey, while I'm here asking things of you, be sure to leave us a 5-star review. I will not settle for anything less than 5 stars. I mean, if you've made it this far, you're in the top percentile of our listeners, and we would love for you to show us a little public display of affection. And while you're at it, be sure to check out our socials on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube, search Listener Newsroom. And don't forget, we'll be back in your feed from 4 p.m. with the afternoon edition hosted by Tash Belling. I'm Chris Spyrou. Catch you next time.
Listener.